This is Toby Capwell, historian, author, and expert on medieval and Renaissance arms and armour. Today he's looking at some of the wargear of the Astartes and Heretics in Space Marine 2's multiplayer.
As usual, when you want to make something look evil, you have to make it look more exotic somehow. But all the joints and the way the plates are all put together, the proportions and shapes are a little different, but basically that's a perfectly functional armor.
And if you've not already seen it, be sure to check out our previous video with Toby, where we broke down the lore, design, and historical references found within the Space Marine 2 campaign. But without further ado, it's over to Toby.
The Roman style is laid on pretty thick here. It looks good though. I'm still amazed by how you can lay all that Roman stuff onto something that's very sci-fi fantasy. And Roman style is a tricky thing to get right, especially if you're trying to create the sense of one society, kind of imitating the Romans. On this Ultramarine, you've got some very overt Roman references. The horsehair crest on the helmet, that was a way of signifying officers in the Roman army. You've also got, piled onto that in this case, the wreath of victory that's placed on the victorious general's head in a triumph, or the winner of a chariot race or something like that. Those wreaths, it's a sign of empire and imperial power. So it works right in with the story here. There's a lot of braid and stuff too, which is vaguely Roman, but also used in the military, in the world's militaries more generally, to denote an officer class. The Space Marines carrying little boxes with bones in them. That's referring to the real veneration in medieval Christianity of reliquaries, where the bones, or otherwise the body parts of saints, holy people, or even the Virgin Mary and Jesus himself, are placed in some incredibly ornate vessel and venerated. Venerations of body parts and blood and things is very much part of traditional Christianity. There was an industry of creating these things in the Middle Ages. Everybody has 10 fingers. Not St. James or St. George seems to have had hundreds of fingers, judging by the number of reliquaries that claim to have his finger in them. They've got the Roman stuff, and then they're piling in a lot of Christian belief and mysticism. Not all Christians believe this stuff. This is Roman Catholicism and a very particular part of it. This is what the Reformation was all about, when people decided they didn't believe all of that anymore. Maybe the Space Marines have forgotten about Martin Luther, I don't know. In my talks and lectures and things, I deal a lot with a traditional weapons identity, something like a sword. Its identity as a utilitarian object and as an expressive work of art simultaneously. You have to think about them both. It's a weapon for cutting your enemies apart, but it's also a symbol of God's power, and gilded and engraved and blah, blah, blah. That's fine with pre-industrial handmade weapons. It becomes much harder to do both of those things when it's patently mechanical, when it's obviously something made in a factory with machines and modern technology. Because that technological industrial aspect tends to kind of cancel out the mystical or aesthetic or artistic power of something like a weapon. There are examples of like submachine guns being gold-plated and given ivory grips and engraved, given as diplomatic gifts and things like that. But it's usually quite a problematic thing to deal with. And with the weapons design in 40K, they are really wrestling with it. They want to find a way of having their high-tech motorized weaponry at the same time as they have this more primitive traditional quality. And it's really interesting when you try and play with that. You're advanced technologically, but you're also in a society that's working in a very traditional, tribal sort of way almost. There's inherent contradictions there, because a tribal society is not big enough to to allow for the kind of social specialization that industrial and advanced technology requires. So there's generally an advancement that the society has to make from a small group to a much larger one. It's kind of hard for me sometimes to believe in a very advanced technological society that's also quite primitive and tribal. Night Lords. I have a strange fondness for the Night Lords. Initially I thought, the gargoyle wings on the helmet is just a little too much. Getting to know them a little more, I sort of have a weird fondness for them.
If we're comparing Space Marines to Knights, the Assault Marines almost feel like they're their own cavalry.
They drop right in where they're needed. That's the trick to using any of these classes of armored soldier, or whatever you want to call them. They have some very distinct strengths, but they have to be used right. And the medieval historical scholarship has kind of overemphasized or over-egged those points in history when armored knights on their horses have been overturned and defeated. Because in the modern mind, obsessed with class and class war, we like any story which shows the powerful, overmighty aristocracy being overthrown by common people. But they're like any weapon, if you use them right, you use heavy cavalry correctly, they're devastating. It's always the same in 40K. You've got a lot of different specializations. If you don't use them right, they will get killed.
This is the Vanguard class, who's more lightly armored. They have a grappling hook to be able to drive themselves towards high-value targets.
Yeah, they're analogous to light cavalry, light or medium cavalry in the 16th century, or light infantry. And again, it's the balance between speed and mobility and range versus punching power and the ability to take punishment. You can't have everything. It's all inversely proportional. And the classes that you see in 40K all have their equivalents in reality, certainly in medieval reality. That doesn't look totally unlike the standard US military combat knife, the so-called K-bar. There we see a pattern blade. There's a couple of different ways historically you achieve those patterns. It's either pattern welding, where you have different metals that are braided and forged together, and that's what creates the pattern if you know what you're doing. Or there's the use of homogeneous crucible steel that can be forged to form these patterns if you then etch it with the light acid. Two completely different techniques that are often mistaken or confused with each other. I'm not so sure whether the Space Marines are pattern welding or using crucible steel here, but it's cool. It's very useful for something like this because a pattern, it's an immediate visual clue. It's visual evidence that you are dealing with quality. You can see the quality because you can only get the pattern if the steel is good or the forging is good or both. You can't get a watered pattern on a crap blade that's made out of crap metal.
Kill them! To the slaughter!
Because you can customize all of the colors of your Space Marines in multiplayer, I decided to go with the 30K World Eaters.
The World Eaters, yep, instantly recognizable. Bad guys wear white. I think they like the white because you can see all the gore on them all the more readily. There is actually a 15th century treatise that talks about how you should set your armor up and how you should wear it and how the undergarments should be made. And they say very specifically in that, your undergarments should be red, ideally, so that if you're bleeding, your opponent can't see the blood. They want to obscure any blood coming from you anyway. So blood being visible on the body has been considered. I don't know what the medieval attitude is to the gore of other people being on you, but that seems to be what the World Eaters care about.
The next class is the Shield wielding Bulwark.
Right, on the Black Templars, appropriately enough. Again, an overtly medieval reference, although they're using Maltese crosses there, which is a different military order. But again, in 40K, you can forgive them almost anything. Well, it's interesting, that you get different chapters. A number of chapters refer, directly to medieval knights, and yet they do it in different ways. I mean, the Dark Angels and the Black Templars are both referring to Middle Ages very directly, and yet they come off very differently.
Is there historical precedent for knights wearing robes like this?
Sure, absolutely. Knights loved wearing clothes over their armor. It's an endless variation of the kind of specific statements that you're making. Knights started wearing surcoats, gowns over their armor around the time of the First Crusade and between the First and Second Crusades. And that's one of these old stories that might actually have some truth to it, that taking their armor into a very hot, sunny environment and feeling that stuff heat up. You're suddenly desperate for ways to keep the sun off of your armor. I'm trying to think of an example where a knight wears a cowl or a hood over his helmet like this. I do remember, I saw in a Lithuanian manuscript a padded cover that's worn over the helmet. It's like a tea cozy for the helmet, basically, quilted, padded cover for the helmet, which is trying to keep it warm in a cold environment. Armor is not good in extremes of temperature, either hot environments or cold environments. It's hard to wear armor in each of those. I think the Dark Angel is wearing his cloak or whatever this is for expressive and ritual purposes rather than anything practical. It's nice to see the variety that they're giving you. Like, they've got a couple like richer grips, like an ivory grip with gold bands on them, or more like the simple K-bar type grip there. And all these different blade types, again, they just sort of sit well with each other and next to each other. You have, more generally medieval type sword blade profiles, and then other ones are, you've got those angular points like a Roman gladius. Somehow it all looks like it belongs together. As usual, when you want to make something look evil, you have to make it look more exotic somehow. The associations that people have between these things are often very precise. It's interesting. When do you have to invoke those associations, and when do you have to move away from them? But all the joints and the way the plates are all put together, the proportions and shapes are a little different, but basically that's a perfectly functional armor. And again, it's nice to see them making that work in a sci-fi fantasy environment. I remember a number of years ago, I spoke to one of the craftsmen who made was involved in the manufacturing of the original polystyrene armor for the 1977 Stormtroopers in the original Star Wars. I asked him about the design of the armor of a Star Wars Stormtrooper. Is fantastically impractical in all kinds of ways. And it bears no resemblance really to how you would build any real functional armor. It just doesn't agree with the anatomy of the human body. And I asked him about that, and he said, no, that was purposeful, because they didn't want it to look anything like a medieval knight. They wanted full armor that said something totally different. So they had to consciously move away from mechanical practicality. That was purposeful. So it's nice to see again that you can move back the other way and make it look like it'll work and still tell the story you want to tell. Most of what I know is really the Horus Heresy stuff rather than the most up-to-date 40K. I'm aware of the Death Guard's earlier history, and some author somewhere had an absolute stroke of genius when he took a member of the Death Guard, one of the traitor legions, right? And he becomes the founder of the Grey Knights. That's such an amazing turnaround, that he's one of the only Death Guard that doesn't betray the Emperor. And it's like you have to take him from the worst kind of traitorous depravity to get the greatest kind of knightly ideal somehow. Again, it's wonderfully playful with the extremes of this. Of course, later the Death Guard become like the most disgusting and awful thing you could imagine. I know there are lots of people that like them, and that's fine. I can't imagine spending hours and hours and hours painting, decaying flesh and intestines and things.
This is the sniper class.
Yep, the camo and everything. People often think that it would be impossible to sneak up on anybody in armor. They hear how noisy armor can be and they think, oh, you wouldn't sneak up on anybody, would you? But you actually can. First of all, a lot of armor can be made to be quiet if you put your mind to it. In large scale live war games that we've done in Germany and things, we've found that even quite large squadrons of cavalry can use the landscape to mask their presence. And they can be like 100 feet away from you and you won't know they're there. If they're on the other side of a rise and the land is masking the noise, or there's wind masking the noise, you can actually be really stealthy even with large numbers of armored men if you know what you're doing.
On the scope, we did an episode of Firearms Expert Reacts with Space Marine 2 with Jonathan Ferguson, and we discovered that the Latin around the edge of the scope says, "Death to me is art."
Well, they take their, the motivational aspects of this very seriously, don't they? I really like the Iron Warriors, actually. Again, they don't seem very likable, but like their Primarch, Perturabo, is a much more nuanced and interesting character than you might have thought, with a lot of Renaissance influence. He's very much conceived as a kind of Renaissance nobleman who's interested in architecture and sculpture and things like that. Not your bargain bin baddies at all. This this design variation from more mobile and less heavily armed right through to very heavily armored and perhaps less mobile. When you're fighting in historical equipment, you have to make those choices for yourself too, depending on how you're fighting, what the environment is. If you pick German, Italian, English, French, all of these different styles in the 15th century, they have all their own choices about the relationship between protection and mobility, and how much of one and how much of the other do you have in your equipment. And they might seem like quite subtle visual differences, but little changes to the equipment. You make that a little bit heavier, you make that a little bit bigger or more inflexible. It has a massive, massive effect on the human experience of wearing the armor.
Advancing towards objective.
I really hope this game is popular and successful, because it would really prove some core principles that I've thought about for myself that have to do with historical authenticity, or at least faithfulness to reality and a regard for the source material. All of those things are really important to me, and they don't seem like they're always popular in modern media, or not always important. And I'd like to think that those principles could also be the factors that lead to commercial and artistic success. I think you can be successful and have some deeper values. If this game is successful, it would be a good lesson for everybody, I think.
Thank you so much for watching. Remember to comment below what other games you'd like to see on the show, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.
Xenos hunger for sensation, but the Imperium is dominant.